Greetings and salutations, all of you lovely listeners out there on the tubes of you, and welcome to another Disinformed Book Club. I'm Shane.
I'm Michael.
I'm Courtney.
And that's it, Michael. Take over.
I
kid. No.
Thank you. Oh, you scared me.
So, if you are completely unfamiliar with who we are and what we do here, we are 3/4 of the hosts of an increasingly popular internet sensation, the podcast that simply will not stop, the Disinformed Podcast, which flees your preferred provider app every marvelous Monday morning. We talk about esoteric nonsense, and we lie about it. That is enough of a preamble, I imagine, but if you want to check us out, you can and should. There's a slew of material that can be found on this particular site in this stream where you can see what we tend to do. But we are chronic, constant readers around here, as has been documented, considering that this is now the third installment of the Disinformed Book Club, and all of the books have been written by one Stephen King. Go figure. We have also had extensive discussions about our Lord and Savior, Stephen King, while we were at Phoenix Fan Fusion this year, so you might say that it is part and parcel to what we do as a show, as we just talk about Kingisms. But our most recent installment of the Disinformed Book Club covered the first in a trilogy. We discussed Mr. Mercedes, which was extremely thrilling, and I really enjoyed that discourse, so thank you both for going down the rabbit hole with me on that one. But we have elected to just keep on swinging, as it were, and so in this installment we're going to be discussing the second part of that trilogy, which is Finders Keepers. So before we start getting into the nitty-gritty, what's the general impression from both of you?
Go for it, Courtney.
I really enjoyed it. When it started, I was really confused because I was like, I thought that we were going to get more of the Brady Hartsfield story, like what is going on. And then as you get through it, you're like, actually, okay, I'm really engaged in this story now. And then they're like, wait a minute, back to the beginning. And I liked the subverted expectation and the way they tie in this new story. I thought it was really fun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. I liked the book as much, like, I liked it a lot. I really liked the build-up. It felt like a slow burn, which I'm always a fan of. I don't need to be rushed into the action immediately, like take me out to dinner first. Maybe watch a movie first before anything else happens. But like, and it did that. It set up, I think it set up a lot of stuff. It gave us all the necessary detail that we needed. And I just, mwah.
You're still a little too charged from our episode this week, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
After all that stimulation, I don't know how you're going to get back. But so starting from the tip of the spear, as it were, and to kind of illustrate what Courtney's talking about, for the completely uninitiated amongst you, there will be a slew of spoilers over the course of this discussion. So be mindful if you have not read these books and you're interested in doing so. You may not necessarily want to go all the way down the rabbit hole with us here. But this book starts out completely removed from anything having to do with the first book, essentially. We are met with a petty criminal by the name of Morris Bellamy, who breaks into the home of a famed author, John Rothstein, which is essentially a composite of a number of famed authors who wrote very impactful books, and so it kind of gives you this odd sort of esteemed writer who has only put out one or two works, and so there's this cache of secreted away materials and notebooks that are commonly sought after. And so under the auspices of breaking in under just petty theft, this individual is actually intending to steal all of these back works and then sell them in order to make buku bank. And the thing that I really appreciated about this when I started reading is I similarly went in thinking like, okay, getting into the Bill Hodges of it all, let's run through. And what I adored about the opening is very much like Mr. Mercedes, you're introduced to characters that you're not going to wind up spending a lot of time with by the end of the book proper. Mm-hmm. And it felt to me very much like one of my favorite shows from the 90s and early aughts, which was The X-Files, where you do have the Scully and Mulder of it all, which you do get attached to them as characters. But one of the things I absolutely adored about how the X-Files was configured is they had their general shows that surrounded the alien thoroughfare, or what they called their mythology episodes. And then interspersed between that was kind of the monster of the week, where you would have just a giant cockroach that they had to battle, or a Sasquatch. So things that kind of changed the entire tone and tenor of the show. And this was carried on with an X-Files alum, Vince Gilligan, when he started doing Breaking Bad and merging into Better Call Saul. You can see that kind of tone of having something very serious offset with something that was comedic. Now, I'm not saying killing an elderly author in his home to try to get his books is comedic, but that subversion of expectation that Courtney was talking about, of like, we think we're going to go right back to, oh, well, the picture moved with Brady at the end of the last book, so something interesting is going to happen here, and then we just completely put that on the back burner, and you don't even really see Bill or any of the other individuals in the book until pretty far along in the plot line. So
Yeah.
you're invested in what's happening without ever getting into the characters you're here to see, which is just incredible writing for an author who can still leave enough on that hook to be like, I'm telling you a story, just follow me. We're gonna get there, I promise.
Stick with
just,
it.
you know, the carrot on the stick, as it were. It's really cool.
I think it helped when he did introduce the Sauber family
Mhm.
and the connection to Mr. Mercedes, with the father
Mhm.
being there at the city center,
Mhm.
and having to deal with that, and that being the initial like motivation for Pete to do the things that he did with involving finding the trunk and taking the money and all that stuff. So there was some connections, but it wasn't a direct connection. It
Mhm.
was a sequel in the terms that, yes, we eventually do get to the actual main characters of the previous novel, but it took, I think it was around the first third
Mhm.
was really setting it up, which was totally fine, because I'd rather have a lot more of that background given then, instead of like jumping us into in media res and like, well, this is how it happened, you're probably wondering how I got here. Exactly, like unless it's done in a comedic way, like I don't like jumping into media res, because then I'm like, well, what's going on, I don't know, understand. And then by the time we get back to now we're at modern present time, I don't remember what happened.
Right. And we're in an instant gratification culture, right? Like we've talked about this frequently, in that all too often the medium rushes to try to give you all the juicy stuff up front. It's like recursion. Let's just have somebody plummet off of a building within the opening chapter, and this is how we're going to deal with threading the rest of the story. And King, like a great chef, knows that things take time to simmer and actually assimilate flavors. Let the aromatics sort of fire off a little bit. Like, you have to make this whole thing like it's a recipe. And you can't just flop down a TV dinner and expect that someone's going to be as fulfilled by the whole process. So you get a chance to really kind of marinate with these characters, figure out what the surroundings are, and this cool telescopic kind of focus shift of starting out with something that's completely not related to the prior story, and then just bleeding in those little elements of like, oh yes, so they were present at the tragedy, and oh, it just so happens to be that there's a connection to a family member that we were familiar with from the previous story, and that's how we finally get bled over into getting Bill and company involved. So I really appreciated the approach. It was really refreshing, and the characters were compelling.
Oh yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rothstein's probably one of my favorites, just as a general King character. Somebody who's like, no, I respect my work enough. You're probably going to kill me anyway, so
Yeah.
good luck.
And then he like went out of his way to make sure that it's like, well, you might like, you're not going to understand this shit. You're a small fry. Like,
Yep.
why even bother? Just kill me, get it over with.
Yep.
Okay.
Just a really interesting, inciting incident for the whole story, which is just par for the course. King is one of the best openers in the whole of literary history for me.
I'd agree. Yeah. He knows how to definitely hook things in. So.
And then what did we think, talking about the villains of the piece, as we all too commonly do, between Morris and then what turns out to be our other interesting villain of the piece, Andrew Halliday, the proprietor of a bookstore who is going to be fencing these materials, the ill-gotten gains, as it were.
I was not expecting to see Andrew in the present day. I thought it was really cool that it was like he was involved in the inciting incident in a way tangentially, and then he was brought back in because of his eventual goal of becoming a rare book dealer. And the fact that he said in the past that he would try and sell them, and now that he, was kind of ostracized from the rare book community because he's done something like that in the past, it was really cool how everything like fit together, but it wasn't like obvious that like it wasn't like it felt like everything naturally fell together instead of like, well, I'm gonna write everything so that it meshes perfectly. Like it didn't feel fake for it. He said at the get-go he was gonna deal with books. That's why he was involved in the original thing. Of course, he's not gonna change his mind. He deals in books.
Right.
So it was that and all the other connections. Stephen King knows how to weave a very great web of interconnectivity. I mean, I don't want to get too general, but looking at other books and other trilogies, other series, etc., that's pretty evident.
Well,
So
the grand
we'll see.
culmination of the Dark Tower, which is what you're avoiding talking about, but
yeah.
yes, where everything is connected. In fact, how about you, Courtney? What did it do for you?
I think it's funny that Michael, you said web, because that was where my mind was at. Is like at the end of any King book that I've read thus far, you feel like the fly that's been totally wrapped up, and then you look back and you see all the things that you missed and how all the pieces like come together. And I think Morris was a really great character in that sense of just kind of the building anger of him as a child and the things that he had gone through. And then I think also this dynamic of being angry at someone who created an art that you like. And it makes me wonder of like what King's experience has been with fans of his own work. Simply just to write that dynamic into a story, I thought was really compelling.
I would go so far as to even ask if he was on the other side, where like, is there a great author that he actually not dislikes, but he has that sort of contempt for because they didn't want to publish some works or something like that? Because I mean, he does love pop culture. He is really a big fan of any sort of media. I mean, there was a story that came out, I think like about a month ago, that he finally revealed what movie that he actually got up and left in the middle of. And that actually became it jumped into the news cycle for like a couple of days. And I think it was like the first Transformers movie that he said he was like, I just got up and left halfway through. I didn't want to finish it. And so like, as someone that really like enjoys pop culture, and you can even see that in the books, whenever he writes for the specific time era the era that it's based in, he does throw out a lot of different like modern or current pop culture things like TV shows and stuff. And it feels like you are in that time.
Yeah, because it's world building.
Yeah. And it's fantastic that he does that. And it's not just he's like, I'm going to throw in something. It's like, well, he knows about it because he's either seen it or he's heard of it or he has some sort of connection to it.
It's funny that you make that connection and jump where like my perspective thinking about this is that one, you write what you know. Obviously. So as an author, he's going to have interacted with other authors. And so Courtney talking about experiencing something similar, obviously Misery is one of the most famed stories that we've encountered just based on having an over-adoration of a fan turning into something almost deadly. And then this is compounded where the first thing that sprung to mind when I was thinking that was not Misery, but it was Lisey's story, which is something that I'm sure neither of you are terribly familiar with yet, but it does detail the life of a woman who is an author's wife who essentially suffers for the fact that he was nearly killed by an overly ardent fan who was a little out of touch with reality, and she wound up having to save her husband's life. A very interesting story. It has some moments that kind of jarred me a little bit, and it wasn't necessarily my favorite in the execution, but the plot is so compelling and the story is very engaging. So as an immersive experience, I loved the sort of plot points that he lays out, and of course the reality that you're thrown into. It's also on Apple TV. They've got that as a series, which is very interesting. And Julianne Moore stars, and very interesting. But in any event, I digress. So as an author talking about someone who's a little bit overly attached to your material, I'm sure he has very likely experienced that in spades. over the course of years. So not entirely shocking that he would go down that particular tributary once or twice. But so talking about the heroes of the story instead, we have the one least likely in general in one Pete Saubers and family, which is a character that, again, King has a really interesting capacity for writing youthful exuberance into characters, and that's kind of an
Yeah.
interesting way for you to engage.
Hmm.
So, for the young Pete and the glorious act of finding a bunch of money, and as opposed to being self indulgent with it, elects to help his family out through difficult times and actually winds up saving his family through it. It was such a cool concept and really endeared me to the character as I was reading. So, how did everybody feel about Pete?
I liked him because he wasn't like the perfect protagonist.
Right.
He made mistakes because he was 17, 18.
Mm.
You know, everyone makes mistakes at that age, and so he like got in over his head and everything, but he always had the best intentions with it. And I think like that's really important as a protagonist, is that, you know, he always had those intentions. Whether or not he executes it perfectly, you know, that's what makes interesting literature. But no, I liked him as a character. I really enjoyed, especially how he would go about things. He wasn't just like completely naive. He had, you know, plans. He always tried to plan things out, especially in his dealings with Andrew. He didn't just walk in blind. He knew that he had a goal. He wasn't going to take no for an answer,
Hmm.
and he always tried to, you know, riposte whatever Andrew would come at him with. So
It's also cool that he became attached to the material and
Uh-huh.
yes,
you know, wanted to protect it because he
yeah,
cared about it, which
that
of course makes the ending all the more harrowing. But
that parallel between him and Morris was really interesting,
mm,
especially because he didn't delve into it. It was only brought up tangentially,
mhm.
but it was left to you as the reader to kind of like make those connections and see for itself, which I appreciate. I don't like, most of the time I don't like things when things are spelled out to me.
Yeah,
So it's not like he's like, oh, just like Morris. You know, it was one of those things where he could see it, and it was kind of like in passing where Pete would be like, oh, I see this connection between myself and my sort of obsession with these books, and him like and Morris, and taking that too far. So it was really cool for him to have that realization, but it wasn't like spelled out. It wasn't written out. It wasn't
yeah.
pages of it.
To your
So
point, it's the rule of great cinema is show, don't tell.
exactly.
Illustrate why people are attached to things. But how about you, Courtney? What did you think of Pete?
I love Pete. I think it's always so interesting. And I think this happens a lot in King's writing where people act like people.
Hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of the books I've read this year, it's been like, nobody acts like that. That's just not how people behave. And it gets to be really frustrating. And then the story doesn't really matter to you
Hmm.
because the choices aren't logical, at least to a certain extent. Like, obviously, you have to have plot devices and it has to
Right,
get
right.
you going. But
Yeah.
to me, Pete seems like a character that was like, no, like I'm putting thought into this. I've struggled. My family's been through a lot of crap. And now how do I help? But also at the same time, he's also learning a lot about himself. And I think that Pete and Morris almost give like a duality of like fandom,
Mm.
in
Yeah.
the sense of you can take someone's work and it can inspire you, and you might decide to go to school based on this passion and kind of really learn and grow with the material, or you can want to hoard it and obsess with it and it takes over your life. And I thought that was a really interesting piece to the story.
And it also it's interesting and telling that one wants to sort of edify other people with it and another person wants to exploit it. And
Uh-huh.
you see how that the opposite ends of the coin depicts their character. The thing that also really struck me about wanting to be, how would we say this? Sort of an ardent enthusiast of somebody who, again, like you were saying, wants the academic aspects of it, of saying, like, this impacted me and it really resonated with me, and I want that experience to be universal, as opposed to somebody who's going, like, oh man, I can benefit from this. Which
Uh-huh.
is kind of akin to what we're doing here now, is that we're having this conversation because we're passionate about the subject matter and not necessarily just because we're hoping to make millions of dollars, Michael.
Oh,
No, that should be like a nice side effect.
yeah, it's cool if that happens, but that's not the main point.
Right. But to your point also that you were saying, Courtney, like I really love that, like you're saying, King gives you an immersive experience. And all too often, I find that a lot of authors really try to hyperbolize their stories because they want, it's like, oh, the pitch, like that 2 minute little tagline of, this is what happens in my book is the
Mm-hmm.
important thing. And all too often, like, yes, that's incidental because really the arbiter of the story for you or the character that you're attached to is the most important sort of, it's the talisman that carries you forward. So if you're not attached to the characters and you don't empathize and you're not invested in them and what happens to them, it becomes a scary movie. Right. Where, and it's funny because that's one of the things that King's lambasted with is that he writes horror novels. And that to me, it's almost the total inverse of what happens in a horror movie, where it's like, okay, there's supernatural elements and the monster is the intrigue, right? It's the
Yeah.
thing that you're invested in. And like, as an example for Michael, for the girl who loved Tom Gordon, you wouldn't care about whether or not this nameless sort of malicious entity is insidiously following her through the forest. Like that is incidental to the
Yeah,
fact
yeah,
that
yeah.
you're attached to this harrowing incident happening to a young girl who has nothing to rely on but her wits, her ingenuity, and her imagination. And like you love that character, you identify with that character, you want her to
Mhm.
succeed, and the story just happens around that. It sort of galvanizes. And King is brilliant at that, of giving you characters that represent a facet of your personality or someone that you can find something of yourself in, and then you're attached to it and you want to see what happens as opposed to just going like, okay, what's happening. Now, there are some stories that doesn't happen. I'm talking to you, Pet Cemetery. But
Well, to that point, and I don't want to detract and go into Pet Cemetery, though that would be a good book club in the future
I
Put it
eventually.
agree.
on the list.
But even then, he still writes those characters and they are still personified. They're not
Hmm.
one dimensional. You might
Exactly.
not like them, and most people might not like them,
Hmm.
but they're still people. They're still characters. They're not just like, oh, I'm the, the trope. I'm this trope. I'm that trope. I'm the
Correct.
Mary Sue. Like, I'm the gruff, muscled mercenary that all I care about is that one last job and then I'm retired. Like they're so much more in depth, and
To
you see that in these characters too.
to your point is like sometimes you love people because of their flaws as opposed to in
Yeah.
spite of them. Like those are there are hooks there, and I like Pet Cemetery's story. I find the characters repellent, but I feel that's almost somewhat intended. So
Yeah,
before I get
yeah.
too far afield, but how about Pete's glorious sister Tina, and of course her connective tissue to the Hodges clan of getting through Barbara, Jerome's younger sister?
It was cool. It was cool that it wasn't a needed connection,
Hmm.
but as I was reading this sort of, I almost called it a preamble, but the first third of the book with all the setup and everything, I was wondering how Bill Hodges would be pulled into this whole sort of intrigue and everything like that. And it was really cool to see that it wasn't like explained away. It's like, well, he just ran into him the other day or something
Yeah.
like that. It was like, well, there are connections and they were established long before they were even necessary for the plot to move forward, which is
Hmm.
one thing that I do enjoy about a lot of his works is that, yeah, this part might be, a plot device to move the plot ahead, but it's introduced in such long, like in the past, like long before it is necessary, that you feel that it isn't just like a plot device or a MacGuffin just for that purpose. Like it
Right.
was written into it. So I enjoyed that immensely, and I think Tina was a really good character in her own right. She wasn't just, oh yeah, Pete's little sister. Like she had her own motivations. I mean, that was the main inciting incident for him trying to sell the books instead of just keeping them or even donating them, because he was toying with that idea as well, because he didn't want to just keep, the books for himself. He
Yeah.
wanted to, have other people experience them. And he was like, well, I want to make money for Tina so she can go to a better school, which I think is very commendable. And especially considering how much he enjoyed those books, to give them up, and then not even to just give them up, but to try and work with seedy people to try and sell them for, money just for his sister, is really commendable. So I
Yeah.
liked Tina and Pete for that reason and for that characterization.
And I think too, to your point, like it's the interconnectivity is what really drives the story. Like you wouldn't really care about Tina as a character if there wasn't as much of the connection between her and Barbara, and how that leads to Jerome, and how Jerome ties into Hodges and Holly. And even in the first book, I think he really lays that out really well, is that it's all Holly's family. Like that really is what that book is about. And then this book, it is, again, this ties more into like Jerome and Barbara's family. And even as you get into the third book, it's those family ties almost that is what hooks you on the story, because you've built a relationship with the characters. And that's really what I appreciate about especially this trilogy. I think that's what makes it special.
Absolutely. And the interesting aspect of this whole thing with having all of that connective tissue is it creates the tension of the story moving forward, because you know ultimately at the end that you've got Morris Bellamy, who's getting out of prison, who's discovering that he's no longer in possession of the things that he was anticipating having when he got out. And that's one freight train moving this direction. And then the pincer movement is that you know that you finally are starting to get Bill Hodges introduced into the story, and being the individual who's going to intercede and help to kind of affect the resolution. So watching those two pendulums set in motion as they start kind of sweeping past each other is the device that then carries you into the end of the story and makes it more compelling. So it's not just, okay, we're just going to sit on whether or not these, and you're really interested. For me personally, I was really invested as to whether or not those books were going to get sold.
Exactly.
Which is bizarre.
I don't want to jump into the end, but I was expecting that there would be some sort of backup. Like I was half expecting, you know, after all the events for Pete to be like, hey, I actually wrote them all down because I've had them for years and I wanted to experience them again. And it's like, oh, sweet. Everyone wins. Most people. But yeah, so I wasn't even just invested in the characters, like you said, but also in those books.
Yeah.
So the books were a character.
Yeah,
absolutely.
They honestly were. Yeah.
It's I talked about this in Courtney. Did you finish the entirety of If It Bleeds, Michael?
I think I skipped the last.
Okay, so you didn't read Rats, because Rats is what
Yeah.
I'm going to refer to. I had mentioned to Courtney in the course of reading, and as like this, so not spoiling anything if you still have the item in your possession, go read this story.
Yes, I do.
It is about a gentleman who is an author who has had like a decent novel that hit, and he's been suffering from, he had kind of a mental meltdown over the course of writing that book, and it nearly destroyed him, and now he wants to write another one. And he has moments of really pristine clarity, and he's inspired to write a story. And they have excerpts of that story throughout the short story.
Oh, okay.
And he talks about the plot line. And from those snippets, I told Courtney, is like, I didn't care about Rats as a story as we got running through. I was like, I just want to read that other book. Like, I'm really desperate to read this Western that is manifesting, because it sounded so marvelous just on the page. And the little snippets that he had were very evocative of The Gunslinger for me. So I was like, oh, I want to read this book so bad. So it's interesting when an author can give you like second level inception on things like that, because I really wanted to read about Jimmy Golden, man.
Yes.
I wanted to get involved in these stories. So just really fantastic. So finally we get around. We won't go into the whole blow by blow to get to the ending, but the culmination of that story and the confluence of events that brings everybody, you know, coalescing into one space is part and parcel to me evocative of the brilliance of King, and perfectly illustrates how he can take the 18 strands of the web, pull them all together, and put it into this beautiful little ball where all confluences just run into one spot, like everything flows to the tower. And the story resolves itself. But all of the craziness that happens between, you know, Morris and Halliday, and that situation blowing up, to, you know, Pete showing up to you know, get the book money, and everything that just kind of explodes towards the end of that book was so riveting to me that I got to the end going like, I could care less that Bill was not present through almost the entirety of this book. When he's there, it's a tour de force as far as like all of the machinations of movements and how everything plays out. And you get to see Hodges doing some real die-hard detective work, which is fantastic. So how is it for everybody else? How about Courtney, since Michael's been chomping at the bit?
No,
I keep
it's so
doing the
fun to watch
waiting,
him
and
do
then
the
I'm
little
like,
eye thing, and then it's like he's thinking, like, I don't want to interrupt that thought.
I understand.
No, I always pause because I'm waiting for you to start, and then I'm like, she's not going.
I'll advocate
Okay,
so
fine.
I don't get yelled at by Steven later.
I'm with you on the ending where it was like next thing. You're like, oh my God, okay, where is this going? And I think with this book in the series, like Bill Hodges couldn't have been there, like, and it still would have been just as compelling. But having him there and like pulling that thread along to connect it to then the final book was really important. And I think really Pete ends up being the hero of the story for me, like regardless of the interactions with Holly and the interactions with Hodges, like that was good, but at the end of the day, like I was with Pete the whole way through. I just wanted to make sure he got out.
Which again, it shows how brilliantly King crafted that character, because you're invested in the outcome for everybody. And even you're wistful about it for Morris, despite the fact that he's just a reprehensible person by the end of this.
I understood his motivations because like everyone has that sort of thing that they hyperfixate on. And especially if you were told that, exactly. If you hyperfixate on something and then you get told that you have to wait a majority of your life before you can do that. I'm surprised that he had it at all together. To be honest, like I can't imagine how I would be in that situation. It's just so desperate to, you've been waiting most, if not all, of your adult life, because he was like 23 or something like that when he
was
originally
a young man.
did the crime. Yeah. And then coming out when he was 50 or 70 something, your whole adult life, you're waiting just to experience something that that you have as soon as you get out, and then to see that you don't. Like, I completely understood him as a villain.
And he endured a lot as well.
Oh,
while that time was going on.
Yeah. Granted, he was in jail for his own reprehensibleness.
Exactly right. Yes.
But that incident, aside from that incident, I understood his motivations behind everything that he did, and the sort of like frenzied aspect. And that even draws it and brings up the parallel that we keep talking about between him and Pete, where it's like that obsession. If Pete had that obsession, would he go as far as Morris? I don't think he would, because he had it more of an altruistic sort of, he enjoyed the books and he wants to pursue that. But I don't think even if none of that stuff happens and Morris didn't get out of jail, I still think that he would have sold those books, or at the very least donated them if he couldn't make money for it.
Well, and kind of to your point, what we were talking about earlier is that Pete knows the story endures because it's in here, right? So he at least has experienced it and can share that joy with other people. And it's not so much the concept of I can make money off of this or I can benefit from it somehow. He's more frustrated by the loss of the story itself, whereas Morris has fixated on the actual artifact itself and how it can benefit him, and thus their responses to the ultimate, culmination of the story. But
I would argue that Morris at the end, like especially when he got out, he just wanted to read the story. I feel like he didn't want to benefit from it any other way. He just wanted it for himself. I mean, still going with that selfish angle.
He had a long time to think about it.
Exactly. He doesn't care about the money. He was like, I mean, he even mentioned it as an afterthought as well before he dug up the trunk. He was like, oh, I get, some decent money and stuff. I won't be able to do anything with it because I'm still on parole and all that. But, it'll be nice to have it a little bit here and there. But I just want the books. I just care about the books. I don't even care about selling them. His immediate thought to go to Andrew and question him was because he's like, Andrew's the
where did they go? Right. Yes.
And also because he blames Andrew for the whole mess.
Yeah.
Because he wouldn't have gone to steal the books if it wasn't for Andrew putting an idea in the head.
Right.
Whether that's true is debatable, obviously, but in his eyes, which are all important for his motivations, it was Andrew's fault.
Everybody's the hero of their own story. Yeah.
Of course. Shit don't mean shit.
All right then.
It was worth breaking the air quotes monetization just for that line.
Oh, I'm glad you're the one who feels it's worth it. No, the thing that I really appreciate for my summation when we get to the end here is also it's like watching a fuse because to your point, Michael, for the metaphor that we've belabored the entire time, it's a slow burn of a story. So when the fuse finally starts inching ever closer to the actual device that's going to combust, the tension starts to ratchet up and things seem to be moving much faster in spite of the fact that it's really at the same pace it has been going. It's just because you know what's on the other side of that fuse and what we've been building toward. So when Bill finally gets interjected and you start seeing all these things twirling up and seeing Holly's brilliant moments as well, like finding these weird cadences that finally get us to the culmination of the story is what makes it all the better for me, because it pays off all of that anticipatory sort of hand-wringing that you've had all the way to the end of the story. So kudos for that. But is there a particular aspect of the book that is kind of your favorite in general for either of you?
I would say the initial meeting between Pete and Morris was very, very interesting because I wasn't I was originally expecting that was how Bill Hodges was going to be introduced into the actual, plot
Exactly.
of the book. And it was really cool to see how Pete was able to navigate himself out of that situation. Not just by quick thinking, but also by quick talking. And like he did. I was surprised that it turned out the way that it did. I figured something terrible, not necessarily terrible would have happened, but I figured like there would have been a little bit more skin taken off.
Well,
More
he's out by the out by the skin of his teeth regardless, but yeah.
But that was probably my favorite part, especially because they were doing a lot of that connection between Morris and Pete for the longest time. And so finally seeing them in the same room and reacting to each other was really like it paid off immensely in my eyes.
Yeah, it's the Pacino De Niro scene in Heat, which, again, I realize who I'm talking to, but yes.
The Pacino, I was like, oh, Godfather. Still haven't seen those.
Okay, yes.
For Unless those, if you tell us to watch or read, we don't know it.
Yes, I know. But someone out there is going to be with me on this. I can feel it. So how about you, Courtney?
I loved the dynamic between Pete and Tina. I think that sibling relationship was really important to the story and to me was really compelling. And even just when it gets to the end, like ultimately, like that was what Pete was concerned about was his sister. And that was just wholesome. Like, and it's a dark story. And to have that like wholesome piece of it of just at the end of the day, like, yeah, there's that happening over there on the other side of the room, but ultimately like getting you out and saving you is my motivation. Like I loved that.
I also appreciate that they are, siblings who share trauma and understanding they're watching their family kind of falling apart, and her finally appreciating the steps that he had taken to try to ensure some solvency there and keep everybody together, and then finally not being the bratty child who's just angry at all of her misfortunes that she has to suffer through, and seeing what he's done and appreciating that really creates that cool bond and cohesion with them as well. It's really fun storytelling.
What about for you?
The thing that really stands out to me with the story is kind of what I was talking about earlier, is it feels episodic. Whereas a lot of serialized books do want to kind of overindulge in giving you, that sweet relief of, give you the candy up front. When it's the Bill Hodges trilogy, you're like, you think Bill Hodges is just going to be the person that runs you through the entirety of the story. And really, like, he's almost tangential to the entire structure in most instances. Because really, as we talked about, the first story is kind of, it's as much Brady's story and then Holly and her family and that sort of set of circumstances. And this is, again, another story that involves Bill in a tertiary capacity, but it's not really his story. So it's fun to kind of watch the way that King executes this by, one, it's a police procedural, and it's kind of a whodunit, but you already have seen the cat's out of the bag. You just want to see how the story resolves. But it feels like you're watching episodic television or on a crime show, whereas
I
like
can see
this
that.
is,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, this week's installment of Mr. Mercedes, which they made a television show of this, so obviously we can talk about that later on as well. But it's a really fun immersion in this world that he created, and you're invested regardless of the fact that, you know, your main character doesn't show up until, you know, the last third of the book, basically. So really fun aspect of his storytelling, and another one of those things that got me further immersed in the adoration of King is it just, regardless of the genre or the story that is being told, he makes you fall in love with the characters, and he presents circumstances in such a way that it's ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And regardless of what that is, whether it's supernatural or not, whether it's something that is escalated beyond control, you're always invested in some way, shape, or form that keeps you moving forward, even in the worst case scenarios. And I'm like, the two that I talk about that were almost revulsive for me are like Cujo and the Tommy Knockers are the two where I was just like, oh man, this is way too far afield for me personally. But even then, there were elements of those stories that I was like, I want to see how this shakes out. Like, I'm really invested. Cujo it was a near thing. I'm still not sure. But Tommy Knockers, I was certainly invested as like, get me to the ship. I want to see what happens. So there's a lot of very interesting little tributaries here. But this is another one of those stories where it's like, I was completely surprised by his approach and where this story went. I had no idea that was where it was going to start by the time I opened it. So what you were talking about initially is like, hooray, another left hook that caught me just completely unaware, much like Mr. Mercedes itself, where it's like, I had no idea this is where the story was going, but I'm ready for the ride.
Oh yeah. And I would almost argue that it would have been a worse book if Bill Hodges was introduced sooner, or it would have been a lot shorter, because like it's one of those things. It reminds me of a certain like fighting or action shows where it's like if they gather everyone together in the first 5 minutes, everything would be solved. Or like even thinking about, because I'm watching through Stranger Things, every single season everyone is doing their own plot arcs, and it's only until the last couple of episodes where everyone's brought together and it's the team up part, the Avengers are back together and all this stuff. So it was really good that it took so long for Bill Hodges to actually get directly involved. And we still saw him doing some other things, living his life, but it was really nice that because if he joined in super early, he would have been like, all right, do this, this, and this, and it would have been done.
If Germany hadn't invaded Poland first, that war might have had an entirely different complexion.
Exactly. And so I feel like the book is better for him just showing up towards the end when he was kind of needed to help push the ending to where it got.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, if he didn't show up in the whole book, I feel like it still would have been a perfectly fine book. And I feel like things would have turned out almost as good as, it did with him in it. So.
It reminds me of the Don't Blink episode of Doctor Who, which it's one of those where the Doctor is just completely tangential to the story, but the situation is so compelling that when you do get that little introduction, you're like, oh, okay, that's what this is. But the characters are so compelling and the situation is so bizarre, and then introducing a new villain, like you're really completely caught by the toe for the entire time without really realizing, oh, this is a Doctor Who episode. It could be anything.
It really could have. That actually, Blink is, I would have to say, my favorite Doctor Who episode, precisely because of that. Like, I mean, I enjoy the Weeping Angels and I'm not going to get too detracted from it.
Yeah.
But like, I feel like if he was directly involved, like Bill Hodges being directly involved at the get-go, it would have been a lot easier. But since he wasn't, and they had to do everything that they had to do, it was really cool to see him being able to tangentially interact with these people that have no idea who the hell he is.
Right.
And so it's the same kind of idea with this book, in that the main character, the main protagonist, if they just showed up, everything would have been solved in 5 minutes. So it was cool to have it just not necessarily stretch out, but for that burn to take longer. so that we can see a lot more things, so we can see these characters develop and not just be like, oh, I have this problem, better call,
Right.
Bill Hodges and get it taken care of.
It helps you create the stakes.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. And it was even nicer when Pete decided that he didn't want to involve any more people. And that's why he hesitated for the longest time, and he only called help when he absolutely felt he needed to.
Well, also, you don't want to be called to the carpet for all that money that you may have spent previously, but it wasn't entirely altruistic, but yeah. Okay. So, as per usual, we got to give our summary approval here, and I have to steal from, the Wrestling Observer here, unfortunately. But how are we feeling about the book? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Yeah.
It's a hand check. Well done. Yes. Well, so if we can give you any further endorsement to go read the book, I don't know what it's going to entail, because I can talk for another hour if I must, but we don't want you to have to endure that, and I'm not sure I want to endure that either. So obviously this does mean that we are pointing towards a third installment in this particular franchise. I know Courtney has already finished End of Watch, so yet again, Michael is being the little cozy caboose back there. But on your time, friend, you don't have to do it within a day. It's fine.
I don't need sleep. We'll just
No, you do.
I'll pull a king. I'll do a couple of lines, and I'll read a lot more lines.
Well, I will say, though, if you do need any incentive, even after having read the first two books, the ending where you do see an antagonized Brady Hartsfield.
Oh my God.
I'm very excited for it.
As I said, you finally get to have your supernatural appearance in this story and watch how everybody deals with it, which this is the real culmination point of marrying Holly Gibney, Mr. Mercedes Holly Gibney, with The Outsider and If It Bleeds Holly Gibney, which I'm really excited about you experiencing. I'm also exceedingly excited to hear what Courtney's perspective is on this, because it's a wild ride, that third book.
They even say The Outsider in that book. Like, that's how crazy connected it all is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not to get too detracted, but Holly does make a lot of connections in The Outsider to the thing that they deal with in this book that I have yet to read.
Exactly.
So I do. I am excited, and especially with the little teases that they gave Brady in the second book, I know it's going to be good. Like I said, I'm gonna pull Stephen King, do a couple of lines, and read a lot more than a couple lines. So
we're not endorsing that kind of behavior on this show. I promise we are family friendly. Allegedly. we love Pete and his family, and that's how we want to comport ourselves. Just
no Arky Barkies here.
Indeed, sustain ourselves with stolen money.
If only.
In any event, looking forward to that, and I'm exceedingly excited to hear what you all think. And furthermore, I'm even more excited to hear what you all think. So, if you have read this book, please chime in the discussion below. Give us a little discussion that we can take part in, because I do love, and yes, obviously, it's always me making comments on YouTube. Michael doesn't have time. He's putting up shorts every 20 minutes, so it's very vital that I keep the comment thread going. But yeah, have a chat with me. Let me know what you think about the book, whether you'd be keen on reading it or not. And if you're enjoying not only the book and the discussions here, but our channel in general, Michael's got some instructions for you.
You can smash that like button, ring the bell, leave a comment, hit subscribe. If I haven't done that, hit the subscribe an odd number of times. Just keep mashing it. Just see how many it takes. Yeah.
I also love that you had to do the Ken and Ryu sort of build up to that.
Yeah, I was expecting you to cut off earlier, so I started and you kept talking. So I was like, oh.
We've been doing this for 3 years. You should know I'm probably going to keep talking. I can't help it.
It was entirely on me. I should have known better.
Well, you trusted me to steer this ship, my friend. So unfortunately, you're along for the ride. But, as always, it's important we emphasize like, subscribe, rate, and review. We'd love to hear from you. We also have new episodes of our podcast winging your way every Marvelous Monday morning on your preferred provider app, so go check us out there. And we have also got a link in the show notes below that'll take you to all of our relevant socials, including our very vibrant TikTok feed. And of course, you can stay on the tubes of you here to find all of Michael's shorts, loaded or
there.
unloaded though they may
Dive right
be,
in.
particularly after last week. I hope you survive. But for the hummingbird eyelash and any other number of stimulants that Michael didn't discuss in this week's episode, that's going to bring us to an abrupt cessation here. Not a premature finish, I guarantee. So, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. I love it. And keep on reading, friends. It's very important that you do so. So, for the Disinformed Book Club this week, I'm Shane.
I'm Michael.
I'm Courtney.
And zippity zoop, we're out of here.
Covers closed.